I want to start with something that I rarely say this directly, because I think the framing of this topic requires a particular kind of honesty that softer language would dilute. What I am about to describe is not poetic justice in the comfortable narrative sense of a story where the person who caused harm receives a tidy and proportionate consequence that restores the moral order of things. Life rarely works with that kind of symmetry. What I am going to describe is something more complicated than that, and more true. It is the psychological reality of what happens inside a person, specifically inside an avoidant, when they betray someone whose depth, whose integrity, and whose particular quality of love was something their life was genuinely organized around, even when they could not admit it, even when their behavior suggested the opposite. When I use the word betray here, I want to be clear about what I mean. I'm not speaking exclusively about dramatic betrayal, the obvious, undeniable ruptures of trust that leave no room for interpretation. I'm speaking about the full spectrum of avoidant betrayal, the betrayal of withdrawal at the moment vulnerability was most needed, the betrayal of silence when presence was what the situation required, the betrayal of hot and cold, of offering enough warmth to build genuine hope and then creating enough distance to systematically dismantle it, the betrayal of allowing someone to love you fully while withholding the reciprocity that full love deserves. These are betrayals. They may not be recognized as such by the person committing them, and that lack of recognition is itself part of what I want to explore today. But they register as betrayals in the body and the psychology of the person on the receiving end, and they set in motion consequences for the avoidant that unfold with a slowness and a thoroughness that is ultimately more significant than any immediate reckoning could be. The first thing I need to establish is why the avoidant had no idea, because the ignorance is not incidental to this story, it is central to it. And understanding the specific nature of that ignorance is the foundation for everything else I want to describe today. The avoidant did not know that betraying you would ruin their life because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what you were to them. Not consciously, not through deliberate undervaluation, but through the particular perceptual distortion that avoidant attachment produces, the distortion that systematically underweights the significance of connection while it is present, and systematically overestimates the ease of its absence. This is one of the cruelest ironies of avoidant psychology. The attachment system that was designed to protect the avoidant from the devastation of loss does so primarily by preventing them from fully registering what they have while they have it. The walls that keep the pain of losing out also keep the full appreciation of having in. The avoidant moves through the presence of genuine, rare, extraordinary love with a dampened perception of its value, not because they are incapable of recognizing value, but because their system is running a continuous, largely unconscious suppression of the information that would make the cost of losing it fully legible. What this means practically is that the avoidant made the decisions they made, the withdrawals, the insufficiencies, the ultimate betrayals large and small, without access to accurate information about the stakes. They did not know what they were gambling. They could not fully perceive the magnitude of what was at risk. The thing they were treating as manageable, as something they could step away from and return to at will, as something that could absorb indefinite degrees of neglect and remain intact. That thing was irreplaceable, and their system was actively preventing them from knowing it. The reckoning begins, in most cases, not at the moment of the betrayal, but considerably after it. This timing matters because it shapes the specific quality of what the avoidant experiences, and it is one of the reasons the consequence is so much more complete and so much more lasting than an immediate, obvious repercussion would be. In the immediate aftermath of the betrayal, in the period when they have withdrawn, or when the relationship has ended, or when the damage has been done and the person they hurt is still visibly, demonstrably present in their orbit, the avoidance defense mechanisms are at their most active. The system is doing what it was built to do. It is managing the emotional reality of what happened by suppressing, rerouting, and reframing it into something that can be contained without threatening the structural integrity of the avoidance self-narrative. This is the period that looks, from the outside, like indifference, like the avoidant has moved on cleanly and without consequence. This is the period that breaks the hearts of the people who loved them, who watch from the distance of their own grief and conclude that the connection meant nothing to the person who ended it. I have addressed this in previous conversations, and I want to address it again here because it is one of the most painful and most persistent misunderstandings in all of avoidant relationship dynamics. The apparent indifference is not indifference. It is the maximum output of a suppression system running at full capacity. It is the avoidant working extraordinarily hard, with every psychological resource available to them, to prevent the full weight of what they did and what they lost from reaching the surface of their experience. The composure is not the sign of someone unaffected. It is the sign of someone who cannot afford to be affected, not yet, not fully, not in a way that would destabilize the foundations they are depending on to remain functional. The reckoning comes later. It comes when the suppression system, which is powerful but not infinite, begins to lose the argument with reality. And the specific trigger for that loss is almost always the same thing. It is the moment the avoidant encounters, in undeniable form, the evidence of what they gave up. Sometimes that evidence is the simple, unadorned fact of your absence. Not the dramatic absence of fresh loss, but the settled, permanent feeling absence of someone who has genuinely moved on, who has redirected the energy they once poured toward the avoidant back into their own life, with a completeness and a self-possession that carries no residue of waiting. The avoidant encounters that absence and something shifts. The suppression system, which had been managing the loss as a temporary state, encounters evidence that it is not temporary, that the door that was always theoretically available to return to has quietly, without announcement, become something else, a wall, a completed chapter, a life that is full and moving and organized entirely around its own momentum, with no structural space reserved for the avoidant's eventual return. Sometimes the evidence is more specific, a version of you that the avoidant encounters, in any context, through any channel, that is visibly, undeniably different from the person they betrayed. More settled, more alive, more fully and unapologetically yourself. The self-respect I described in previous conversations, now fully consolidated into something that registers on the avoidance perception with a force that bypasses all of their usual filters. Either way, when the evidence arrives, the reckoning begins. And the reckoning is not gentle. Here is what the reckoning actually looks like from the inside of the avoidance experience, and I want to describe it with the clinical precision it deserves, because I think there is a tendency in conversations like this one to either dramatize it into something more obviously punitive than it actually is, or to minimize it into something more tolerable than it actually is. Neither distortion serves you. The truth is more useful. The first layer of the reckoning is cognitive. The avoidant begins, with a clarity they were previously unable to access, to accurately assess the value of what they had and what they chose, through action or inaction, to destroy. This reassessment is not a soft, nostalgic thing. It is sharp. It arrives with the particular precision of a perception that has been suppressed for long enough that when it finally breaks through, it carries the accumulated pressure of all the time it spent being held back. They begin to see you accurately, not the managed, slightly diminished version of you that the suppression system was allowing them to hold, the version calibrated to make the loss feel sustainable, the real version, the specific, irreplaceable, extraordinary version. Every quality they unconsciously discounted while you were present now presents itself at full resolution. The depth of your perception, the integrity of your love, the particular, unreproducible way you saw them, not the persona, the real person, and stayed anyway. The patience that was not weakness, but was in fact one of the most demanding forms of strength. All of it arrives, suddenly and with uncomfortable clarity, at its actual value. And alongside that clarity comes the second layer of the reckoning, which is considerably more difficult to sit with. The recognition of their own role. Not in the abstract way of someone who intellectually acknowledges having made mistakes, but in the visceral, accountable way of someone who can now see, with the accuracy that time and distance and the undeniable evidence of consequence provides, exactly what they did and exactly what it cost. They see the moments when they withdrew instead of staying. They see the times when presence was what the situation required and they chose distance. They see the pattern, the relentless, self-perpetuating, ultimately self-defeating pattern of reaching and retreating, offering and withholding, being just available enough to sustain your hope and just unavailable enough to prevent the kind of genuine intimacy that would have required them to be fully seen. They see all of it, and they see that you absorbed all of it, with a grace and a generosity and a depth of patience that they did not earn and did not honor and ultimately did not deserve. And the shame of that seeing is one of the most acute psychological experiences an avoidant ever has. Now, I want to get specific about what I mean when I say the betrayal ruined their life, because I think this phrase requires unpacking if it is going to be genuinely useful, rather than simply satisfying in a way that does not actually serve your healing. I do not mean that the avoidant's life collapsed visibly. I do not mean that the consequence arrived in the form of obvious, external, observable disaster. Consequences in the domain of emotional and psychological life rarely work that simply. What I mean is something more specific and more lasting than that. The betrayal ruined the avoidant's access to a particular quality of life that they did not know they were dependent on until it was gone. Specifically, it ruined their access to the version of themselves that existed in relation to you, the version that was being reached and seen and gently, persistently called toward its own potential by the specific quality of your love and your attention. That version of themselves, fuller, more alive, closer to the integrated, genuine person living beneath all the defenses, was not something they could have created alone. It required you. It required the particular resonance of what existed between you, and they chose, through the accumulation of betrayals large and small, to destroy the conditions that made that version of themselves possible. What replaces it is the life they had before you, or rather, a diminished version of that life, because the before you life did not yet know what it was missing, and the after you life does. The self-sufficiency that once felt like freedom now feels, in the honest moments, like a ceiling. The emotional containment that once felt like sophistication now registers, in the unguarded hours, as a kind of poverty. The independence that the avoidance ego was organized around, the pride in needing nothing, requiring no one, functioning cleanly without the vulnerability of genuine attachment, is now haunted by the knowledge of what needing looked like when it was real and warm and returned. That haunting is not dramatic. It does not incapacitate them, but it does not leave either. It becomes part of the background texture of their interior life in a way that colors everything. Every subsequent connection that fails to reach the same depth, every quiet evening that has a specific quality of incompleteness, every moment of unguarded reflection that arrives at the same conclusion and then gets hurriedly redirected before it can be fully felt. I also want to address something that I think is important for your understanding of the broader psychological consequence. The betrayal did not only affect what the avoidant lost externally, it affected what they became internally. There is a principle in psychology that I find consistently true in my clinical work, and that I think deserves to be stated plainly here. We are shaped by the choices we make in the moments that matter most. Not irrevocably. Human beings are capable of genuine change, and I believe that with my whole professional self. But consequentially, every time we choose the defended path when the open path was available, the defended path becomes slightly more default. Every time we choose withdrawal over presence when presence was what was needed, the architecture of the withdrawal becomes slightly more established. Every time we betray someone who deserved better because the alternative required a degree of courage we could not quite access, the gap between who we are and who we could be grows slightly wider. The avoidant who betrayed you made those choices, in those moments, repeatedly, and each choice reinforced the patterns that made the next betrayal slightly more likely and the genuine alternative slightly more distant. The betrayal did not simply end a relationship, it deepened a wound. It made the walls slightly higher, the defenses slightly more practiced, the distance between the authentic self and the defended persona slightly more habitual. And now they are living in the life that those reinforced patterns have built. A life that is functional, often. Avoidance can be extraordinarily functional. A life that may even look, from the outside, like success, but a life that carries the specific private knowledge of what was possible and was not taken, what was offered and was not received, what was real and was not honored. Here is what I want you to do with everything I have shared today, and I want to be thoughtful about this, because I am aware that the topic we have been discussing carries a gravitational pull toward a very particular emotional response, toward satisfaction, toward vindication, toward the sense of finally having the scales balanced in a way that the experience itself did not provide. I do not want to take that from you entirely. If some part of what I have described today provides relief, if knowing that the betrayal had genuine psychological consequence for the person who committed it makes the weight of what you have been carrying slightly easier to bear, that is a legitimate response, and I will not pathologize it. You were hurt. The acknowledgement that the person who hurt you is not simply living an unaffected life in the aftermath of what they did is a form of basic relational reality that you deserve to have confirmed. But I want to offer you something more useful than vindication. Because vindication, however satisfying in the moment, keeps you oriented toward them, keeps the center of gravity of this story located in what happened to the avoidant rather than in what is happening to you. And what is happening to you, what has been happening to you throughout this entire process, whether you have been fully conscious of it or not, is far more important than any consequence they are experiencing. You have been doing the work they would not do. You have been sitting inside the full emotional weight of what happened, not managing it, not suppressing it, not rerouting it into the comfortable numbness of distance, but actually feeling it, processing it, allowing it to move through you rather than building walls to keep it out. And in doing so, you have been becoming someone whose depth and whose integrity and whose capacity for genuine, eyes-open, fully accountable love has not been diminished by the experience. It has been forged by it. The avoidant had no idea that betraying you would ruin their life. They did not know because they could not see clearly enough, through the distortion of their own wound, to understand what was actually at stake. They were making decisions in the dark about something that deserved to be handled in full light, and the consequence of those decisions is now woven into the fabric of their interior life in ways that will outlast any temporary relief that the withdrawal or the distance or the maintenance of the walls has ever provided them. That is true, and it matters, and you are entitled to know it. But here is what matters more: what you built in the aftermath of their choices, the self-respect, the inner authority, the hard-won clarity about your own worth and your own depth and your own non-negotiable right to be loved with the same completeness with which you love. That is not a consequence. That is not a side effect. That is the primary story. You were betrayed by someone who did not know what they had, and in the space that their not knowing created, you discovered something about yourself that you might not have found any other way. The avoidant lost you, and in losing you, they lost access to the version of themselves that you were calling into existence. But you did not lose yourself. Through all of it, through the withdrawal and the silence and the pain and the long, unglamorous process of healing, you found yourself more completely than you had before. And that finding, unlike everything the avoidant let go of, is permanent. It belongs to you. It cannot be betrayed. And it is, in the end, the only thing that was ever worth fighting for.